Welcome to the Tech 45 podcast. I'm your host, Jack Ryan, where we discuss all things human machine interface. That includes transportation, aviation, aerospace, medical technology, and manufacturing. There's probably a few other topics that we'll discuss too, depending on what our experts in the field want to talk about. This episode, I had the great pleasure of interviewing one of the infantrymen that I served with in Afghanistan. His name's Shane Pendleton. He was integral into our success, not only on the battlefield and maneuvering our strikers on the battlefield, but also all of the tireless effort it took to maintain those vehicles when we were back at our company outpost in Southern Afghanistan. Shane is an incredible family man. He's a father. He's a dedicated husband, and he works his butt off in the commercial trucking industry, adopting new technologies to support not only his day job as a driver, but also using technology to support his family farm if he wasn't busy enough. Shane's work ethic is incredible, and I'm really grateful I had the opportunity to host him on our first ever podcast, the Tech 45 podcast. Hope you enjoy. Okay, so welcome to the Tech 45 podcast. This is the first interview with Shane Pendleton. I'm the host, Jack Ryan. Today, the topic will be heavily focused on diesel motors, heavy equipment, and transportation. He was trying to connect to Instagram. I'm going to cancel that. Okay. So we're good. We'll start over one more time. Sorry about that. I was hearing like an echo in the background. Okay. So welcome to the Tech 45 podcast. I'm your host, Jack Ryan, where we discuss the intricacies and marvels of human-machine interface with all things transportation, aviation, robotics, and aerospace. Today, we're lucky to have Shane Pendleton. I served with Shane Pendleton on our deployment to RC South in Southern Afghanistan. He was integral to our success on the battlefield due to his extensive knowledge about diesel motors, complex machinery, and really just his work ethic and the way he set an example for our platoon. So, Shane, I wanted to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. I know I got your bio from the document you sent over, but if you could just briefly, tell us about yourself and kind of where you're at now in life post-military.
You were with me through much of my military service, and yeah, we got through that deployment, came home, I got out. Since then, I've just really been doing nothing but really driving trucks, number of different places. Ready mix for almost 10 years. Worked for a derailment company. Over the road for a while. Started having kids, and that got to be too much. So came in off the road and took something where I could be home every night. And now I'm into something where I've got a relatively set schedule. Home every night, around the same time, leave the same time every morning, and get to drive a truck and play with heavy equipment all day.
Yeah, I think one thing I wanted to highlight is I was always impressed and fascinated by your affinity for machines. I think this was something that I overlooked when I was serving with you, but there's a reason that none of our strikers broke down on deployment, and this wasn't common in our battalion. It's something I want to highlight. And I wanted to kind of get your take on preventative maintenance on diesel motors. So I think this is something you did really well. It was so obvious that you were so meticulous in the way you inspected our vehicles, everything from the tire pressure, the nitrogen system, coolant, oil level. I mean, there's probably hundreds of systems in the Striker that I don't even know about. And for those that are not aware, I want to kind of give people a brief overview of what a Striker is. A Striker is a infantry carrying vehicle that is meant to carry. It's a crew of two, so you need a driver and a vehicle commander. And then in addition to that, you can carry 9 infantrymen in the back. So that was an Army requirement to be able to give infantrymen on the battlefield more mobility basically have a serviceable field expedient vehicle that can travel at highway speeds. I think you mentioned that the governor limited the Striker to 52 miles an hour, at least
Yeah,
the
I
ones we
believe
had.
that.
Is that what you said?
Yeah, it's been it's over 10 years ago now, but yeah, I think our trucks were governed at like 52 mile an hour,
Yeah,
which
that sounds right. I don't.
for an armored
Yeah,
vehicle, that's moving.
I think so. So my perspective is that's moving pretty quick. I think you can cover some ground with a Striker, and I guess if you compare it to other armor vehicles that run turbine engines, like the Abrams, for instance, yeah, you have a lot more armor protection, but you don't have as much mobility. I don't know if you ever saw an Abrams out there, but it pretty much needs to be followed by a fuel tanker everywhere it goes, just because it's so thirsty. It's I don't even know how many
Right.
miles per gallon it gets. It probably is two miles per gallon, maybe. But I guess back to my question is, what sort of preventative checks did you use on the diesel motors that we deployed with, i.e. the turbo diesel Caterpillar engines? I think they were 7.2-liter Caterpillar engines. What sort of preventative checks kept our Strikers operational on the battlefield? And then what sort of preventative checks do you do in your current role or your role with Ready Mix that has made you successful as a driver?
Um, the most important thing is just fluid levels, oil and coolant. You know, if those are kept at in operation levels, it'll you know if your coolant's full, your truck's not going to run hot unless there's something else broken. If the oil's full, you're not going to burn up a motor. Um, and it's every check it every day, and okay, every 4 days we need to put some oil in it because they used oil. Um, but I don't really recall us ever using a lot of coolant. I know we had it on hand. Say it's been again over 10 years ago, but it's the same way now. I just every morning I open my hood, I check my fluids. That's the very first thing I do. I don't even take the keys out of my pocket
Still
yet.
to this day, you still do that.
Yeah, every
You,
morning.
you still do that every day. Okay, cool, cool. How often is that overlooked, both in your experience in the military and then your civilian career? How often is that overlooked? I'm just kind of curious.
It's it, it's one of those things. It's just too common, um, and within even within our company, you would see it. We had to borrow another platoon's truck one day, and I put a gallon and a half of oil in it before we left the gate.
Yep.
And it the same way out here. If I have to drive somebody else's truck because my truck's in the shop and somebody isn't here today, and won't go. First thing I do is go check the oil, and okay, yeah, this truck needs a longer dipstick because this one doesn't reach the oil.
Okay, I didn't think about that. So a lot of times people don't even have the right measurement equipment. I mean, they don't even have the
Well,
right tools to do the job.
now that was a joke. It's like you pull the dipstick out and there's no oil on it. And you try and look at the mechanic. You say, "Hey, man, I need a longer dipstick. This one doesn't reach the
So
oil."
funny.
Yeah, because the truck
So
doesn't have
funny.
any oil in it.
Oh my gosh. To me, so a turbo diesel, for those of you who don't know, I think the Army requirement, I've heard this as a rumor. I don't know if this is true, but I've talked to some of the engineers that worked at Caterpillar Defense, kind of the defense arm. So the Army is very closely intertwined with all the vehicle manufacturers in Detroit and all around Michigan. There's a large supply chain for Caterpillar, GM, and a lot of the Army vehicles, as you know, are based off those designs, which makes it more cost effective for the Army, but it also gives them access to spare parts, fluid compatibility, fuel compatibility. And the Army pretty much runs on JP8, which is something that I'll talk about in another post, in another podcast. But I think it's important that you highlight a lot of the petroleum products have to be available, and then the people have to actually check it daily before there's a problem. Because I'm thinking those highly tuned Striker engines, if you don't have coolant, if you don't have the proper levels of coolant or oil, that can be catastrophic to the engine. Um, could you kind of break down, what would happen if you didn't have a proper amount of coolant and or oil? Like what would happen internally to the engine, and how much damage could it cause?
Like for reliability's sake, those motors had systems in place that were smart enough. If it lost oil pressure or if it overheated too much, it would derate itself or shut itself down completely. Now, yes, that saved the motor, but now you caught with your pants around your ankles out in the middle of the battlefield, needing
Okay.
recovery because now you've got a vehicle that's inoperable.
Could those ever be overridden by the operator? Those
Not
systems?
pro, not without the computer on hand. So yeah, from
Yeah, that
inside
makes
within
sense.
the vehicle, the operator couldn't override that.
Okay, I don't think I really even thought about kind of the computer. I'm assuming you're referring to like the diagnostic tools that our mechanics had, like the
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
okay,
They plug into the diagnostic port, and if okay, this it'll have codes in it. Okay, this is why this is something that could have caused it to shut down or do what it was doing, and they can disable those for X amount of time, and it'll let the truck will run, it'll drive. To okay, let's see if we can't find out why it did this.
okay, okay. I didn't know that. That's really interesting because I remember I saw some of the NCOs that were within our battalion support. Was it? I guess our whatever branch of the BSB, our support folks that were augmenting our company, our maintenance NCOs. I saw them pull out what looked like some sort of tactical diagnostic tool. Is that similar technology to what is available in the Caterpillar engines or whatever engines that are in semi trucks that you guys use? I mean, is there
But
some sort of diagnostic tool or is it
yeah,
totally
it's
different?
very similar. Yeah, you just especially with these newer trucks, a lot of times you can't work on them without a computer, and somebody has
Okay.
to plug in. Okay, this is what's wrong, so we need to check this sensor or this valve, or it won't let you get to the. A lot of times, it won't let you get to the point where you can diagnose it manually. You need to plug in and see what's going on.
Okay. I think that's something I want to kind of pull the thread on a little bit more because I've had the same experience working on my own vehicles. I've noticed as vehicles progress, I mean, if you can call it that, there's a lot more electronics, a lot more circuitry, a lot more fuses and different wiring harnesses. Basically, a lot more stuff that can fail.
Right.
And in my experience, I'm kind of more of a Toyota Honda guy for my personal vehicles. It's not always easy to diagnose a lot of the failures on our Honda, especially with the ignition system. So I guess one of the things that I wanted to ask you, I meant to ask you this earlier, is going back to like your first impactful interaction with a machine, because I know you're kind of a gearhead. I mean, you just have an affinity for motors that I love. It's something that I wish I had. I love machines and motors, but I've never gone into the weeds like you have. So I want to know, what's your earliest memory of having an impactful interaction with a machine? And I think you wrote this in the document you sent me.
Yeah, it was at the family farm mowing hay with my grandfather in the summer times. Um, we got a 1975 International 1066 that's still on the farm to this day. Uh,
Amazing.
and I was 5, 6, 7 years old inside the cab of it. He's obviously sitting in the seat running the tractor, but I'm in the cab with him, kind of sitting on the fender, and I rode thousands of miles sitting in there with him. Wouldn't know what.
That's amazing. Keep going. Yeah, I
Yeah,
did not want to interrupt you.
it was just It's I could see it plain as day, and it's been over 30 years ago. There he was drinking Coors Light and smoking 3 packs of Cools a day, and I was just happy as a clam to be there with him.
What an incredible memory. My earliest memory of an impactful experience with a machine was similar. My uncle unfortunately was semi paralyzed. He had muscular dystrophy, which started as a child and kind of progressed, and he deteriorated. His muscular system deteriorated over time. So he was in an electric scooter. And as a 6-year-old kid, he came to visit us at our house where we were living at the time. And I remember riding on the back of that scooter and thinking, and this is back before I had any experience with electric motors. But his little electric scooter, we would ride around our property, just going in circles. And it was like my own little roller coaster. And I know it's kind of a unique memory with my uncle, but I'll never forget the feeling of like riding on the back of a motorized vehicle, and he would let me control the throttle. So that was probably I never thought about that. I've never made the connection. That was probably what kind of initiated my fascination with kind of interacting with a machine in a way to kind of propel yourself faster. I mean, this thing wasn't super fast. We weren't breaking any land speed records by any means, but just riding on the back of that electric powered scooter was fun to me as a kid. I don't know, that sticks out as a memory for me too. And it was just so much fun sitting on his lap and just pulling the throttle as far as it would go on the handlebar. So I don't know.
Right.
I guess I'm always fascinated too. I had a former colleague who collected antique farm equipment, everything from tractors, actual, mechanical devices. How does a what year, 1975 International?
Yeah.
How does a tractor like that stay in operation for that long? You mentioned it's still working.
Um, I got one of my cousins still lives up there, and he's been a diesel mechanic ever since he graduated high school. There was a diesel college in Iowa. He graduated the following fall, went to that college, and came home after he graduated. Worked at Kenworth for a number of years, and then owned his own roadside mechanic business for almost 30 years. Just so, really, yeah, just him, knowing what he was doing and when it needed to be done.
Okay, so you got an expert that's maintaining the motor. Is it still the original motor?
Yeah, that's never
Okay,
been apart.
that's amazing. I guess I want to hear about your experience. Before the era of diagnostic tools, in a personal POV car, you have the OBD2 port, which a lot of people are familiar with. I think that's pretty common. Like the input is very relatively common, and those diagnostic tools are pretty well understood by people with a baseline of automotive knowledge. But before the world of diagnostic tools, and what you're describing, this motor on this 1975 International tractor, um, how did people diagnose issues with a diesel motor? Like, what sort of methodologies did they use?
Well, a diesel motor's pretty easy to diagnose if it's not running. There's really only two things that it can be. It's either not getting fuel or air, or
Okay.
something internally has failed and something isn't working inside. Um, and you can listen, you know, different sounds they'll make, vibrations that you'll feel. Um, there's coming out of the oil out of the crankcase. There's a tube that comes out. It's called the blow-by tube. And if
Okay.
the engine's lost compression, the compression that's being built inside the cylinders is pushing past the rings, and it'll cause what's called blow-by. And you'll start seeing smoke come out of that tube. And that would be something that would tell you have a compression issue, because
Okay.
the engine's getting essentially air pressure built into somewhere that it's not supposed to have.
Gotcha. Okay, I never made that connection. Because I've never owned any vehicles with a diesel motor before. There's a few pickup trucks I've looked at that have some of the smaller, diesel motors that GM's come out with in the past few years. I think some of the 4-cylinder diesel motors, they put out impressive numbers for their weight, but I guess I've always been nervous to adopt, new motors that have not been proven. Some of these motors are they put out great specs, but I always question the reliability of newer designs that haven't been widely adopted across either the consumer market or the industrial market. I mean, are there certain motors that you can speak to that you use currently in either your daily job or your job with Ready Mix that kind of are a cut above the rest as far as quality or reliability that you would trust more than others? I'm kind of curious to know if there's a particular type of either brand or like a type of motor configuration that just works better than others. It has better harmonics or whatever.
Um, all the every truck I've ever driven has just got an inline 6-cylinder diesel engine. Personally, I like a Cummins motor over anything else. Uh, Now, as far as big trucks, but like uh, trucks here at home, I've got a 2001 7.3 Power Stroke, which people listening will know those things are world famous.
Yes, they
Um,
are. Yep.
but in today's age, with all the emissions and everything, all the exhaust systems and everything that have to meet the emission specs, it's getting harder for them to make motors that are putting out real good horsepower at a price point that is reasonable. Um, so what you're seeing a lot of is PACCAR started making motors for trucks now, and they're a reliable engine.
Okay.
Um, I, but they're not like an old school Cat or Cummins motor. They just don't perform the same. Caterpillar doesn't even make engines for semis anymore.
I didn't know that. Yeah, I was
They
unaware
quit
of
doing
that.
that. Yeah, they quit doing that. Oh, late 2000s, early 2010s, I want to say. No,
Okay.
for sure, 100%. Caterpillar built their own semis for a few years, and shortly after they started doing that, they said, okay, the only way you can get a Caterpillar motor is you got to buy our truck. And then they
Ah,
just when they quit building their own trucks, and it was just we're not building motors for trucks anymore. Which
okay. I didn't make that
Caterpillar made
connection.
a really good motor, um, and I know I know guys right now that have got old Caterpillars that are still running. Um, but yeah, they just decided they didn't want to do it anymore. And
Huh,
I don't know
that's
why.
interesting.
Everybody speculates, but I don't really know why they did. I never really read into it.
Yeah. No, I didn't know that. I just assumed they still made them. I imagine they still make motors for their own like heavy industrial equipment,
Oh yeah,
perhaps, or maybe.
yeah,
Okay.
for bulldozers, wheel loaders, all that they still make their own motors. But as far as trucks going down the highway, they don't make motors for them. They still make parts. So if you've got one of those old motors, you can still get parts for it. But with anything else, something like that, it's going to cost you.
Oh, I have no doubt about that. I think this is true for aviation motors. I know more about that than probably diesel motors. The aftermarket revenue that some of these OEMs get from spare parts, that's the bulk of their profit. It's the motors are a competitive environment, like on the diesel side of the house, but some of the turbines that go in these turboprops, turbofan type motors, um, it's a very competitive environment. There's a few major OEMs like Honeywell, GE, and Pratt and Whitney, Williams International. They all make great turbine motors. So it's a competitive environment to get that motor spec'd onto the airplane. Um, so they have to sharpen their pencils and come out with a good price to sell the actual motor to the OEMs that are making the airplane. But I think they make up the bulk of their revenue. If you look at like the 10-year life cycle, the first 10 years of a motor that is in service on an aircraft, they make the bulk of their revenue from spare parts. I imagine it's similar in the diesel motor industry. I don't know that for a fact, but I'm curious to hear your perspective. So you talk about Caterpillar motors. It seems like you speak highly of how the motor is structured from a reliability perspective. Is there anything about the Stryker ICV Caterpillar motor? Are there any design features that surprised you when you first started working with Strykers?
Not really. As far as a Caterpillar motor, it was just a kind of a shrunk down version of a motor that would have been in a semi, like
Okay.
the C15 motor that was out roughly about the same time. It was just kind of a shrunken version. I believe those were a 13 or 14 liter motor, and the Stryker was what 7.2.
Yeah, let me confirm. So I'm reading this. This is straight from military.com. This is I'll just read the description of the Stryker combat vehicle that you and I spent a lot of time in. Yeah. So this is saying that it was the original one was spec'd out as the Caterpillar C7. Does that sound like the correct
Yeah,
nomenclature?
it had a Caterpillar C7 in it.
Okay. So yeah, so the Stryker has a Caterpillar C7 350 horsepower motor. They might have upgraded the horsepower since then. There's been a couple iterations of the Stryker since you and I have gotten out of the military. But the 8-wheeled Stryker combat vehicle is the U.S. Army's Stryker Brigade combat team's primary combat and combat support platform and the focal point of this ongoing phase of the Army transformation. I think one thing to highlight, I think just so the listeners understand, we rode in the infantry carrying version of the Stryker, but there was also, so we rode on the ICV, infantry carrying vehicle. There was the mobile gun system, which had a 105 millimeter cannon on it. I don't think they make that anymore. I think those have been phased out. They have a mortar carrying variant, which has doors that open up on top of the vehicle, and then a mortar tube, 120 millimeter mortar tube sticks out. They have the reconnaissance vehicle, the commander's vehicle, fire support vehicle, medical evacuation vehicle. So that would be your medevac, your dedicated medevac vehicle. You got the engineer squad vehicle, the anti-tank missile vehicle. I wish we got to shoot some of those. And then the NBC reconnaissance vehicle. So total, I think there's up to like 8 or 10 configurations, and it's meant to be a modular platform, so that everybody uses the same architecture, the same motor, the same fluids. So if you were to go work on an MGS and help some of those guys out, you would be able to jump right in and do a PMCS of at least the engine components. I think you and I probably wouldn't know much about the mortar systems. I think that requires some specialized training. I never got
Right.
trained on that stuff.
No, I didn't
I never
either.
got trained on the loading system for the mobile gun system either. But anyway, I just thought that was interesting. That like I think the Army did a nice job with that. The Army is always very, very focused on modularity, and so
Right.
they want to have one type of motor for 10 vehicles. I think it makes a lot of
Right.
sense. It's
Well,
probably
yeah,
yeah,
all the different variants aside, and yeah, the platform was the same, so it didn't. If if we absolutely had to, you know, a guy that can drive one of them can drive all of them. So if we need something happens and we need to get this from point A to point B, and the guy that normally drives it isn't around, we can still make that happen. We're not
okay.
Everybody's not standing there trying to have a 20-minute discussion about how you turn it on when things need to be happening. And
Yep,
it was
that's
very
a great
modular
point.
platform.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I wrote an article. I meant to share with you before the interview, but I totally forgot. I wrote an article about Captain Kearns. So Captain Kearns served. I don't know if he was infantry, but he served in Vietnam. I don't know what his MOS was, but he was in combat trying to sustain some of his vehicles. I think, namely the M113. I think that was one of the main vehicles they had in Vietnam, but a variety of different vehicles for different purposes. I'm not an expert on the vehicles that were in service during the Vietnam era, but one of the key problems that the Army faced was all these different fuels. So the Army had a bunch of different mixes of fuels, and they relied on local additives to try to have the right mix and put the right fuel in the right vehicle, and they're always screwing it up. And that's just what was happening. And I'll never forget, I was at a CTC rotation right after you got out of the Army. I had the fortunate to go to another CTC rotation right after we got back. So I walked. So I think one day we were fueling the Strikers at JRTC, and I pull up to the fueler and I say, "Hey, can you fuel up these whatever 8 Strikers that I had right behind me?" And I saw the words jet fuel written across the fuel tanker, jet fuel. And I kind of thought that was strange. Normally you see JP8, and I said,
Right.
"Hey, I don't know if that can go in the Striker. Is that compatible fuel with the Strikers?" And he like looked at me like I was dumb. Uh, he was very respectful. He said, he kind of made me feel at ease. He said, "Sir, it'll be just fine. Don't worry about it."
With all
And
due
I
respect,
found out
sir.
later, with all due respect, sir, I was friendly with him. He was a really nice guy. He was working the night shift at a fuel repoint. What was that? Fort Polk, Louisiana. So I feel for him. But the Army switched to one fuel for combat vehicles for both ground systems and aerial systems. So you could put the same fuel in a Striker that you could in an Apache, which I
Really
thought was super interesting. Yeah, yeah. So that
wild.
problem that isn't that wild? Captain Kern, this this issue that he had in Vietnam, Captain Kearns, he went on to become General Kearns. And he was in charge of like pretty much the Army's entire sustainment plan as a general. And so, he was able to kind of solve the issues that he faced in combat in Vietnam so that you and I didn't have to worry about multiple fuels. I mean, you
Right.
still had to make sure you had all the right other petroleum products and coolants, but those are all color coded for idiots like me. But I thought it was interesting that like the Army had the foresight to, and this has been like kind of a large, heavy lift for the Army to go to one fuel. That's not easy to do.
Right.
But they basically, the Strikers, they're specced out for JP8, but if JP8 is not available, they can also use other forms of diesel fuel. And then obviously there's aviation fuels within the military that are of a higher grade than the typical, fuel that we would get. But I just thought that was really interesting. That was a really, really smart move on the Army's part from a logistics standpoint.
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, just to keep and yeah, they keep the wrong fuel from going in the wrong thing. If we can make one fuel that'll run in everything, that's yeah, whatever you've got, yeah, pull your strikers up here and fuel them, or like you said, land your Apache and we'll fuel it if we can. Got to ground
Yeah.
it and fuel it up.
No, 100%. Yeah,
And
hundred percent.
and even from a standpoint, when we were deployed, we didn't have anything but JP8 on anything that ran on anything but JP8 on the cop. The generators and the trucks, that was it. And it was the same truck that fueled everything. Strikers come back from a patrol, stop by the fuel truck, top off, and the same fuel truck got fired up 3 times a day and driven around and topped off all the generators.
Precisely. No, precisely right. And I didn't even think about all the support equipment that was stationary on our combat outpost. I didn't even consider that. That wasn't even that's not even something I wrote about. I'm going to add that into my article. But yeah, I'm going to share the article with you once I'm done with it, because it kind of draws the parallel from there's certain things that combat leaders and combat personnel learn in certain conflicts. And, it seems like we're always, we're making mistakes in the Army, and then the Army does some things that make a lot of sense to support, a global force. And we have footprint that pretty much spans the entire globe. And it's likely that we'll probably have footprints on other planets too, or at least the moon as a near-term, home base. I think we'll have, and that's going to be critical, because the further out you go, if you think about the bases that we have in Japan or Guam or some of these islands in the middle of the Pacific, they have to be able to be sustained by, dropping fuel blivets, coming up with vehicles that are more energy efficient, maybe going to a hybrid powertrain. So let's pull on that just for a second, because I listened to a brief down at Fort Moore, formerly Fort Benning, and you probably are familiar with Fort Benning, as I know.
Very familiar.
Yeah, they renamed it. It's no longer Fort Benning. It's still the same suck, but just a different name to make people feel better about it.
It's still Sand Hill.
It's it's still
Sand
Sand Hill. No, they haven't changed Sand
boys.
Hill. Yeah, and girls too. So anyway, that's for a different topic, different time. So one thing that I found interesting, I totally lost my train of thought. So one thing that I was at a briefing at Fort Moore last fall. I was at the Maneuver Conference, which is a big conference that they hold every year, and they bring in experts from the field that are working on Army equipment, that are designing new motors, from General Motors to Caterpillar to Honeywell, new weapon systems, new optics, new unmanned aerial vehicles, anything you could possibly strap on a soldier or put on an Army vehicle. There's an expert there ready to talk about it. I found it fascinating. That's what I love. I love that kind of stuff. And one of my former company commanders gave a speech about hybrid electric architecture within new Army vehicles. And I'll frame it for you, but I'm really eager to hear your thoughts, because you're kind of living in the commercial end of this, which is what the Army kind of draws their supply chain from and their new technology from, is kind of what you guys are using. The Army is going to adopt it because it's readily available. The engineering is already done. The NRE costs are already accounted for. But the Army is having a hard time deciding upon a hybrid electric drivetrain because, well, there's two reasons. One, it's still difficult to have the same energy density in a battery that you can get with JP8 or jet fuel. It's just not there yet. So for the same equivalent weight of a lithium ion cell, JP8 holds a lot more energy. It's just a fact. That'll maybe change once they come out with some new engineering or manufacturing techniques to allow lithium ion cells to hold more energy, but that's just a fact that cannot be overlooked. The energy density of jet fuel is better than a lithium ion battery. It's just a fact. So the second thing is, and we've seen this with Tesla in the United States, the electric battery cells rapidly iterate and become better and better almost every year. So knowing from what the Army acquisition strategy looks like and how slow it can be, because there's a lot of stakeholders, a lot of levels of approval to field anything new in the Army, which we saw. By the time the Army fields this lithium ion battery that's cutting edge right now, the Army might take 8 years to field it. By then, not only are those batteries obsolete as far as the technology that's available, so they're technologically they're 8 years behind, right? Everyone understands that. But it's actually some of those OEMs that work for those battery companies don't even produce those types of cells anymore. So think about that. So
Right.
the technology is moving so fast with hybrid electric drivetrains that if you buy something that was manufactured 8 years ago, there's a good chance that you won't even be able to get parts to sustain that hybrid electric drivetrain.
Right. And the hybrid electric thing, you're kind of adding links in between, the internal combustion engine that you're going to have, and the actual putting the power to the ground. Um,
Yep.
Obviously, yes, when the motor's running, it's turning the drivetrain. But then when you try to run on battery power, if something has gone wrong and that battery power isn't there, um, now do you have enough fuel to get back on your fossil fuel?
Precisely.
And I,
Yep.
then there's even been the talks of the Army wanting to go fully electric, which now you're just adding links into the supply chain. Okay, now we've got a JP8 powered generator that's charging our vehicles at night or whenever time we have. And when was the last time you saw power lines on a battlefield?
I mean, none that were not generator powered by JP8,
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're precisely right. I mean, and there certainly could be a place for solar technology. I can think of a couple applications on our outpost in Southern Afghanistan where solar technology probably could have ran a refrigerator,
Oh,
probably could have
absolutely. Yeah,
ran
there
lights.
was no shortage of
Yeah.
sun.
Right. No, precisely. So there's a time and place for solar and electric, I think. And so you hit the nail on the head. What you just said is like spot on, and you described it in a much more succinct way than I could have. But one of the things that I wanted to add to what you said is, so you have this trade-off between, you want to stay quiet. Electricity is great for that. You can sneak up on people on the
Oh,
battlefield.
yeah,
That's a
it's incredibly
phenomenal
quiet.
capability to have. It's incredibly quiet. So that's a pro. But the range is not there. Like we just described, the energy density on a lithium ion cell is nowhere near what JP8 is. So your range is limited. Okay. The other thing that, a hybrid. So let's go back to an electric drivetrain. Electric drivetrain would be great if, let's say, you planning on, getting to an observation point, an OP, parking your military vehicle, and then running the battery bank for an extended period of time to, let's say, utilize a remote weapon station, an RWS. That is a great application for a battery bank because you're not having to run the motor, so you're quiet. Your thermal signature is low, so you're harder to detect because you don't have a. I mean, what are diesel motors? What temperatures do they operate at? I have no idea.
Your coolant and fuel temperatures, your coolant's going to run about 180 degrees, and your oil temperature is going to run about 210 degrees.
Yep.
But
So boiling.
Exhaust temperatures are higher.
Okay, so the exhaust temperatures would be a problem.
Did you ever get a chance to look at a Striker through the thermals?
I did. Oh yeah, a couple times.
Yeah, it just had that hot spot right there on the top of the exhaust port, but it wasn't very big.
Yep. The Army's made a significant effort to reduce the thermal signature of all their vehicles for that reason.
Right. I don't remember exactly what the system was called, but yeah, it was the whole exhaust system was had kind of a thermal dampening system built into it. I remember the civilians from General Dynamics explaining that to me.
That's so cool. So were you there for the initial fielding? Like, were you there for all the initial fielding of the Strikers, or did you get there to the unit right afterwards?
I was there day one. I'd been at the unit for, I don't know, 6 or 8 months when the first Striker showed up, and everybody was actually on block leave, and a handful of us that hadn't gone on leave went to the very first OpNet that General Dynamics put on there at Bliss.
Okay. So that's cool. I actually didn't know that. So you were there for the actual OEM led OpNet training that GDLS put on.
Yeah.
Okay. So
all their civilians came down, brought them in on the rail, and we went out to the motor pool one morning, did PT, and there was a handful of trucks sitting out there.
Oh, cool. Okay, I didn't realize that. Would you say you had kind of a better baseline knowledge of how diesel motors work than most 11 Bravos or associated personnel that worked on the Strikers? Did you have a better base? I know I have an opinion about this, but I want to hear your opinion on this. Did you feel like you had a better baseline knowledge?
Better than most, yeah.
Yeah,
There were
I feel
there
the
were a
same way.
handful of guys that we were on about the same plane. There was a few guys that knew a good deal more than I did.
Okay. No, good to know. And how was your experience with the GDLS guys? I always had positive interactions with them, but I didn't spend a lot of time with them.
Oh, I never. I don't think I ever once had a negative interaction with one of them. If you remember Jordan, one of the mechanics that went with us.
Hmm.
He
Yep.
actually tried to
Vaguely. Yep.
he actually tried to recruit me to get me to go work for General Dynamics because he knew I was getting out.
Yeah.
And
No
I
surprise
asked him,
there.
I said, well, what do you make? He said, I can't tell you, but you would like it. But I had to move out to the West Coast, and I didn't want to do all that. I was ready to come home.
I think you made the right call. I think I don't know. I didn't put enough emphasis on kind of the family and support network that would have benefited me when I transitioned out of the military. I really struggled. I did the opposite, and I was just kind of looking for the first available job. And that's kind of how you're programmed as a guy in the Army. Like you just kind of go wherever the Army sends you. And I was still in that same mindset. I didn't make a pivot early on enough in my life. I'm at home now. I'm back in my hometown, and it's the best thing I ever did for me and my family. I think you probably feel the same way about where you live. But I don't think I've underestimated like the value of a support network, especially when you're starting a young family like you and I are in that phase of life. The support network you can get from family members is unmatched. So
Oh, absolutely. Um, and my wife and I joke we were married 5 years before we ever spent an anniversary together. Our
really,
first our first anniversary we were deployed. Our second, I was in Chicago when I worked for the derailment company. Our third, I was driving over the road, and remember the next two, I don't really remember where I was, but yeah, we were married 5 years before we spent an anniversary together.
wow, I did not realize that. Yeah, it's so funny. I was active duty for 4 years, and I spent I don't know another 8 years in the reserves in various reserve units, and I think overall in my 4 years on active duty, it was limited time. I was away more than I was there, and I
Right,
was newly married when I joined the military. Again, we got married in my second year in the military or something like that. And yeah, I was definitely away more than I was present, which was difficult. And I know a lot of active service members still struggle with that. I mean, the op tempo that when we were, I'm thinking about our deployment 2012, 2013. I mean, the op tempo for any of those premier Stryker Brigade combat teams was pretty high, and it was probably just as high for the light infantry units too, from what I've heard from my friends that were in those units.
right.
Yeah, I think so. I really like your perspective on the hybrid electric drivetrains. I think as far as technology in your current role, I kind of wanted to get your perspective on because I don't think a lot of people realize this. I had a guy in my reserve unit, phenomenal guy. He was about to get promoted to E5, and he was just like, "Sir, I got a missed drill this weekend," which no problem. He had to go interview with Walmart to be a driver for Walmart, and he had worked tirelessly for years and years to build up the experience and the credentials, kind of working jobs that he didn't necessarily like, but the end goal was to be a driver for Walmart at one of their big distribution hubs, and he wanted to be home every night. So this job provided all that, great pay, great benefits, and I don't think I realized just how important companies like Walmart or Ready Mix put an emphasis on safety and having a safe driver because the liability, no matter what you're hauling, is huge. Just because the massive vehicle you're driving over the road, it's probably even more so. The liability is even more so if you're carrying any sort of hazardous chemicals, hazardous waste, flammable materials. Can you talk a little bit more about how you build up that reputation in your industry for being a safe driver? Because I know it's highly valued, and if you're a safe driver with no record of having any sort of accidents or illegal movement, traffic violations, that's valued like across the world. So I don't know if you can talk more about that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. If you've got a clean driving record, there's really not a whole lot of companies that won't take you as long as you have the other qualifications you meet. Um, I left the ready mix industry in September, and the company that I'm with now, my background check was taken quite a while, and I was
Sure.
in regular contact with the manager, and he told me, he said, the only thing we're waiting on is your driving record. And I said, well, I've got an immaculately clean driving record. I'm like, if I get stopped by the police, I don't even ask to see my insurance because they've already ran my plates before they come up to the window and know who I am already. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, finally when that came back, he's like, all right, man, yeah, you're good. Um,
Cool.
and then you'll have guys that, they got a speeding ticket or a seatbelt ticket in a commercial vehicle, and that's a big thing. And I've seen people not get hired because of that. Um,
Yeah.
other, texting and driving, obviously, or fail a DOT drug test or alcohol test. Um,
Hmm.
just about 3 weeks ago, I went and did the first random DOT drug and alcohol test that I'd done in years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Obviously, no problem passing it, but a lot of guys don't. And
I
I've
believe it.
seen guys, that were good drivers that uh, you see that little silver car parked there at the driver's room in the morning, and the next thing you know, you don't see somebody anymore.
Ooh. Yeah, I believe it. It's the same issue in aviation. My experience in aviation is limited, but there's such a high value put on safe pilots. I mean, you make kind of crap money when you're first starting out as a commercial pilot because you really don't have much experience. And my flight instructor, when I was getting my pilot's license, told me like he didn't feel like his eyes were fully open to what was going on around him in the cockpit until he was at like 2,000 hours, and that's 2,000 flight hours. That's not
Wow.
2,000 like hours including prep time. That's like 2,000 hours controlling the aircraft. I mean, you're normally on an autopilot, but yeah, in the cockpit, in the air, 2,000 hours. He felt like only then did kind of the veil get lifted off of his eyes, and he was able to like really deal with a multitude of weather situations, traffic situations, major airports, communications. Um, so it's similar, and as you progress in your aviation career, the guys that are flying those long haul flights, say I think the longest flight that I'm aware of was either Atlanta to Shanghai direct or Dallas to Sydney, Australia direct. Like, these are like 17-hour flights.
Yeah, that's a
These
long time.
yeah, these aircraft weigh. I think one of the largest aircraft ever made was the Airbus A380, and had a gross weight of 1 million pounds with fuel. It's hard for me to fathom like a aircraft that big. They don't make it anymore because it was too
Right.
difficult to fill all the seats to make it economical, as you can
Right.
imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. We can't afford gas for this thing.
That was the limitation. And so not only that, so there's two things. So it was difficult to make the economics work correctly unless you could just fill every seat and every cargo hold with paying customers. But the other thing was, and this, I'd be curious to hear your take on this too, on the commercial trucking industry. You're now able to have smaller airplanes that have more fuel efficient engines that can do a lot of those transatlantic flights now, where you couldn't before. So the best example of this is the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. It's one of my favorite aircraft in the world. And it's one of the first twin engine kind of, it's still a wide body jet, but it's much smaller than, an aircraft that has 1 million pound gross weight. But the really the key part of the whole equation is that the engines burn less gas, which enable you to travel further. Um, and not only does that kind of allow you to use a smaller plane, it's easier to fill the seats, but it's more economical. The company makes more money. Everyone's happy. Have you seen any like fuel efficient improvements during your time in the commercial trucking industry?
Nothing incredibly notable. Obviously, from over the years, I've seen the engines, they get a little more fuel efficient, but most of the time, like I just happened to check the other day, my truck averages 6.1 miles to the gallon. And yeah,
Okay.
you're shooting for anywhere between 5 and 8, obviously being ideal. Um, but as much as I drive, 90% of my driving's all city miles, so you wouldn't expect to get the optimum mileage out of the truck that I'm driving. Um, say that they haven't increased a lot, but they've been with horsepower. How do I want to word it? They made for a while they had 600 horsepower motors in just about any truck you could buy. You could get a 600 horsepower motor,
Okay.
and those motors actually got really good mileage because the motor wasn't having to work as hard to get to highway speed.
Interesting.
You're limited to how much you can haul. Well, now we've upped the horsepower, so now the motor doesn't have to work it hard; it just goes. And those motors actually
Okay, that
got
makes
really
a lot of
decent
sense.
mileage, but then with the emissions laws starting to tighten down on everything, those have kind of gone away. The emission system just kind of chokes the motor out, and
Yeah, that's been my
there's still
experience.
there's still motors that make that power, but they're expensive.
Yeah, that's been my
You
experience
wouldn't
too.
want to
Our work trucks.
a fleet of them.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think you're spot on. Our work trucks we bought our work trucks. Unfortunately, this is before my time at the company, but we bought our work trucks the year after they implemented those DEF systems. And so if they'd been bought a year earlier, we wouldn't have any of those DEF systems embedded in the engine. But it's been a pain in the butt. I mean, we can't really travel if we do some of our longer trips to various military bases. We can't travel without DEF in the back of our trucks.
Right. Yeah.
And
And now we've
and
got
not
the
only
cardboard
that,
box and a plastic
yeah.
jug that we now have to throw away.
Yeah, it's so ridiculous. I could go on about that. I mean, you and I could probably talk for an hour about DEF and but really, that's not the most bothersome part for me. For me is, one of our trucks, we were heading back from Fort Moore, and one of our trucks, the DEF system actually failed. So, I mean, there was DEF fluid in there. Our guys did everything they were supposed to do. They always top off the DEF. But one of the sensors that's associated with the DEF system failed. So it was giving the ECU or whatever system that it was reporting to an inaccurate reading. And then basically what happened is the engine kind of went into limp mode. So it's like, all right, well, now your governor is limiting you to 50 miles an hour or less. So
Right.
that now you just doubled your length of time on I-95. And then the next step is that you can't go above 30 miles an hour. And so luckily they were able to crawl to a dealership. It was a very expensive repair. It was a multi-$1,000 repair. And I keep thinking to myself, I'm like, I mean, if the DEF system, it's an unnecessary system to the engine function, but there was some regulatory landscape that I'm not aware of. Maybe, I don't know, it's some regulatory requirement that was kind of implemented for diesel motors that I don't quite understand.
Yeah, it's all the new emissions laws started way out on the West Coast is
Of
where you
course.
started seeing it. And then, yeah, it's just migrated across the country. And yeah, if it was the first model year of having a system like that, there's going to be problems with it. Yeah, they do all kinds of R&D and testing before they release it, but they're not going to have found all the bugs.
Yeah, it's been our experience. It's been a lot of bugs. It's
and
caused us a lot of heartache.
And it's another thing, you're just adding links in the supply chain. And
Yeah,
it's just
I'm a firm
something
believer
else that you have to buy that's $4 a gallon.
I'm a firm believer that less parts in a system are generally better. The less parts, the less complex the system, the better. There's less that can go wrong, and it's also easier to
Oh,
manufacture
absolutely.
and sustain.
And it's easier to diagnose when something does go wrong.
Yep.
I've got 3 moving parts, and now all of a sudden nothing's moving. Okay, it can only be one of 3 things. Okay, now I've got 50 moving parts, and now nothing's moving. Well, now I've got 50 things to look at.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think, one of the things too I wanted to talk to you about. I know we're jumping around. I'm not very good at this whole podcasting thing yet. I wanted to talk to you about some of the. So you mentioned the driver safety. I want to dive back into that because I think it's so critical. I have a huge amount of respect for people that drive large commercial vehicles on the road. I always make an effort to let them get in the lane. I get out of their way because honestly, it's a stressful job. It's a stressful job. It's high liability. If there's something to go wrong, I mean, just the company's liable, the driver's liable. There's just a lot involved that people don't recognize. And I want to explain to people, not only how critical the driver safety is, but what sort of safety features or systems are in the cockpit of those trucks that you're operating.
Those systems have made leaps and bounds in the last 10 years. Your truck will have sensors on the front and both sides. And a lot of passenger cars even have these systems too. It's just, hey, you're getting too close to the car in front of you, or hey, there's a vehicle on your passenger side that's in your blind spot. just different tones that will go off that let you know what's going on.
Yep.
Um, and then yeah, and you mentioned that you stay out of the truck's way or let them get over. We really appreciate that, but there's a vast majority of the population that don't do that, and we're just in their way. And if you're going down the highway and you see a truck, there's room, but a truck has left room between him and the vehicle in front of him. And that room's there for a reason, so he can stop safely.
Yep.
And they run up and they take that away from you. Now you've got to give yourself that room again, and somebody else takes it away from you. It goes on and on. And cameras inside the cabs of the truck have become a big thing. A lot of guys don't like them. Personally, I have no problem with them. Don't do things you're not supposed to do. They will actually keep you out of trouble more than they will get you in trouble. You get in an accident, we can go back and look, what happened here? Okay, yeah, the driver, he was paying attention to what he needed to do. You cut in front of him, and now all of a sudden traffic came to a stop, and he couldn't stop as fast because he's a lot bigger and a lot heavier.
Yeah.
Or, you just tried to cut over to, ran into him and ended up crashed in the ditch. It actually happened to a friend of mine last summer. Car was passing him, went to cut over in front of him, wasn't far enough ahead of him, got into his steer tire, his driver's side steer tire. And the way the road lays right where it happened is the road sets up on a big road bed, and it's just a big hill down into the kind of a hayfield. And I saw the dash cam video of it, and the car's first, he's kind of just going with the car, traveling against him, kind of going off on the shoulder, hoping that this guy will get away from him. But then you can see when he decided, no, you're not going to push me off the side of this hill, and he turned the wheel back into him and spun the car around the front of him. Nobody got hurt. The car got torn up a little bit, stopped in the ditch. The boss came down. Mechanic came down, drove his truck back to the shop. He had to go take a drug test. Went and took his drug test. Everything was fine. He was back in the truck that afternoon.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting situation. I just I'm a huge proponent of driving safely, putting the phone down, just driving defensively. It's really the most dangerous thing that most of us do every day on a daily basis. I can't really think of anything more dangerous that the average person engages in, unless you are in some sort of risky job field, or you have risky, behaviors outside of work. So I think what you said is important, and it's interesting to hear your take on the cameras that are facing in, because I've talked to a lot of my friends that are in law enforcement, and they say the same thing as you. They say as long as you're not doing anything you're not supposed to, the body cams that they wear,
Right.
both on
Yeah,
their vest.
that protects both of you. That protects the person they're interacting with and them. Yeah,
It
that shows
does.
who was
Yeah,
wrong if something goes to court.
it does. And I'm arguably I'm going to be, almost 99.9% of the time I'm going to support the LEO because they're usually in the right. Unfortunately, the bad apples get publicized immensely. We're going to go into that too. I'm going to interview one of my friends who's a police officer in Florida, and we're going to go into in depth about the technology that he's used, like kind of stuff you're describing, dash cams, body cams, really to prove like, hey, no, I was doing the right thing. The other person was committing a crime, and this is what they're doing, and here's the video and audio evidence to support that. I mean, he mentioned though that they initially tried to field cameras that were inward facing on his patrol cars, but I think they got rid of those. There was some sort of, I don't know if it was his union rep, or I don't know if this might be nationwide, but they said that was an invasion of the officer's privacy because they're in the patrol car for sometimes 12 hours a day or more. And I understand that, but do your trucks have outward facing dash cams too? Is that standard
Yeah, inward
equipment?
and outward facing cameras. And
Okay.
my kind of take on it is, you're on the clock. You don't have privacy right now. You're being paid to do a job. Do your job. If you do need to take a personal phone call or something, step out of the car.
Yep. Yeah, more people could benefit from that advice that you just gave, even if you're not getting paid to drive around, and if you're not, driving huge equipment on the road like you are. I think, it kind of worries me, thinking about my kids being even on the sidewalk in our neighborhood. You see so many people that are driving distracted. You can just see them. You can see the
Every
LED
day, all
screen.
day, every day,
You
all
see
day,
it,
every
yeah.
day. Yeah,
I mean, I was walking my dog this morning and I wasn't really paying attention. It was like 4 in the morning. And by the way, I'm glad that I have a 4 a.m. buddy like you because most of my friends are still sleeping. I'm so glad I can like text you and send you random Snapchats and like,
but
hey, like I'm glad
I
somebody else has a
I have to remind myself that you're on Eastern time because I'll get your Snapchats and it'll have the time on there, and I feel kind of like a loser. I'm like, it's 5:30, and I'm like, no, it's 4:30 here.
so
I've
funny.
been
I
I've been up
really
and going for 30 minutes, but man, he's way ahead of me.
I just really appreciate it. I think you and one other friend of mine are extreme morning people, just
Yeah.
by nature or by necessity. It just that's the way you get shit done, in my opinion. But I was walking my dog just down the street from my house, and this guy in this black Mercedes flew by the stop sign, and it was shocking to me. I mean, I've seen people speed through our neighborhood before, and I understand everyone's in a rush, but you really don't save that much time even by going 15 or 20 miles over the speed limit. Like you're not really saving that much time. You're really what you're doing is selfish and you're endangering everyone around you. I mean, the
Right.
speed limit's posted there for a reason. Um, and even with all the technological advances and sensors you're talking about, like you still have a human in the loop, very much in the loop.
Right.
Um, and so I don't know, it just bothers me that people can act so selfishly when, that's not only is it the most dangerous activity that most people are engaged in every day, but I mean, you could really hurt a pedestrian too. I mean, this guy, luckily we didn't do our normal route. We were moving parallel along the sidewalk. So we were going the opposite direction of him, but we were moving parallel along the sidewalk. And normally we cross the street into this little park, and he would have obliterated us. I mean, he didn't even
Oh
slow
yeah.
down. Blew right through the
Yeah.
stop sign, four-way stop sign in a residential neighborhood, 25-mile-an-hour speed limit. Crazy.
Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, luckily it
Um,
was 5:30 in the morning where not a lot of people out. Um, I we live in a very rural area, um, dead end road, gravel road. So I'm not as concerned with my kids out. My kids don't get out by the road though. Um, I have to yell at my kids to come inside at night. Um, but yeah, I see it all day, every day. The phones. I've seen people driving down the road eating a bowl of cereal, bowl of noodles, reading a book. I've seen it all.
It's crazy. Yeah, I can't imagine. I felt you were always very much attuned. I mean, I rode with you like I think a few times on deployment. I can't even know. I didn't keep count, but I always thought you were like a very conscientious and like active driver. You were always searching for threats. You were reporting. I mean, you were using like your tactical communication skills to report stuff to me, even if you weren't in the same vehicle as me. And for those that have never been in a military vehicle, you wear a CVC, which is a helmet with a communication device, kind of like this, and then you have internal communications with the people that are plugged into the internal comm system. So you have an internal intercom to where, like, like me and Shane are speaking right now, even though we're in different states. When you're in the same vehicle, you can talk to the crew that has these communication devices on their head, but then you can also key the mic and then activate your high frequency radio system and communicate with the other vehicles in your platoon or in your company, your battalion, depending on what type of radios you have on board. Do you use a lot of the radio equipment in your truck? Is that used? Like, how is that used? I guess I'm like, how do people that are either loading up freight or equipment or doing dispatch activities, how do they communicate with you? I'm kind of curious about that
Wow.
too. I don't know how that works.
Yeah. The almost 10 years I spent in the ready mix business, the radio was key because you're talking to dispatchers, you're talking to the other drivers because a lot of you're going to the same place, a lot of the same jobs, or reporting traffic, or pedestrian walking down the shoulder when it's still dark outside. Um,
Cool.
things you live by the radio. And
Okay.
my time I spent as a trainer, I'd have the radio up where you could hear it. Guys would turn the radio down, like, hey, that's not your radio to turn down, Jack. Leave that up where you can hear it. If somebody needs to get a hold of you, they can get a hold of you. Now, flip side to that is we like to have story time on the radio. There wasn't the professionalism that you and I were used to. Hey, say what you need to say and shut up. Or somebody gets on the radio to say something, but he uses as many words as he can to put out as little information as possible. We don't need to know the ingredients. We just need to know what's for dinner.
Yep.
Um,
No, you're spot on with that. That's one thing that I had a. So I want to tell you a funny story. I never told anybody this really. I I had a hard time transitioning from military speak, Roger, over. This is what I don't know, Centurion 1-6 over. I don't even. It's been so long since I've done any sort of like tactical communications that I can't even do it anymore. But when I was learning how to fly an aircraft the year after I got out of the army, it was such a difficult habit to break because what you're saying about saying only what you need to say, that's taken very seriously in aviation because you have to monitor the radio if you're flying an aircraft, and you have to keep the radio clear for air traffic control, the control towers, other pilots, ground crew that might be clearing deer off a runway. That's a real example, by the way. So you have to keep the radio clear, and there is no story time allowed. You can actually get fined for that kind of stuff, for clogging up the radio, and every aircraft has to have like an what is it? It's an FTC license, I think, especially for the HF radios. So my flight instructor that I had when I was learning how to fly had to kind of pretty much slap my wrist and be like, "You can't say over. Like you have to just say your tail number, what you're doing, and that's it." So it was basically how it went is I'm just going to make up a tail number. All aircraft that are registered in the U.S. have a November tail number. It's kind of like your
right.
license plate. So I would say this is November 123, altitude 2000, landing, Kansas City, November 123. That's it. There's no story time. You just say your tail number, what do you want to say, and then your tail number. So it's a
Right.
bookend. You bookend the communication with your tail number. And I should probably talk more about this on another video, but it's like it's taken very seriously. And I was saying like Roger and over when I was talking to the control tower, and that's a no go. Like they don't like that. It's an unnecessary word, and you have to choose your words extremely carefully. And that's not easy when you're learning how to fly an aircraft because you're still having to think about what you're saying, while you have a hand on the yoke. And luckily, the key is actually on the yoke. I think it's on some yokes have them on both sides, but if I can't remember, I think they're usually on your left side. Yeah, so you're holding the yoke with your left hand, which is typical if you're in the left seat. You're operating the throttle with your right hand, and then you have two pedals. So you're using all four appendages to fly an aircraft, and that's true for an airplane or a rotorcraft. It's even more important with a rotorcraft, like a helicopter. Anyway, I went on a tangent there, but yeah, I was curious how you interacted with your dispatch and some of the jobs you've held, and then I guess the other thing I'll leave you with too is what type of emphasis was put on maximizing the load you guys can carry? Because I have some friends that work in software that's focused on freight optimization, and Uber Freight is one of the most notable ones. But they basically try to figure out some algorithm to make sure that every semi trailer is full, as full as it can be, given the route and the customer load. And I thought that was fascinating. That how much emphasis is put on optimizing like the maximum load you can carry.
Um, Everyday freight. It's we want to get every ounce we can on this truck because every ounce we don't is an ounce. We got to hire another truck to do it. There's also there's DOT regulations with how heavy it can be, but as long as we can stay within that, and it's not just an overall weight. You'll see, like, pay attention when you'll see the numbers on the side of the truck. It'll say 80,000. That's that's a gross weight he can have, but he's also only allowed a certain amount of weight on each axle, and
Okay, I didn't know that.
different states, different highways allow different things. Um, I don't know if you've ever spent a lot of time up in Michigan, um, around where all the steel mills and everything are. But you'll see these trucks that just got an insane amount of axles under them. And that's because in the wintertime when everything's frozen, they let them run almost unlimited amount of weight because all those axles are helping spread the weight out on the road.
Oh, okay.
In the
I didn't
summertime,
realize that.
right? In the summertime, things kind of change. I'm not 100% familiar with this. It's just kind of from talking to guys over the years. But yeah, those guys up there are allowed to run a lot more weight in the wintertime because everything's frozen.
Huh.
Here where I'm at, without needing to pull a special permit, you're held at 80,000 pounds. And Kansas City's got an industrial zone. I believe it's up to 100,000 pounds you can run inside the industrial zone. Um, it's all, but and then you start going overweight. Over that, you have to contact DOT, give them all your information. You have to have the truck weighed to let them know how much over you are, and you have to buy a permit for that weight. Or if your load hangs off the sides of your trailer, you have to have an oversized permit, and that will determine when you can travel on certain highways, when you can be within the city limits of certain cities. They don't want a lot of oversized traffic on the road with your normal rush hour between 5:30 in the morning and 8:30 in the morning. Once
Okay,
that's
I never thought about
if
that.
you ever hear a truck driver talk about a curfew, that's usually what he's talking about is I can't be within this area from this time to this time. But then once that's over with and the traffic kind of mellows out, then you can come through there, and then you'll have a certain time in the afternoon. Okay, we got to be out of there by curfew. Or if we're still in there by curfew, now we got to wait till curfew's over before we can move again.
Okay, that's cool. So there's a lot more similarities with aviation than I realized, and maybe because you have the same, federal bureaucracy overseeing
Right. Well, yeah,
both
it's all
aviation.
it's all a transportation. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
covered
yeah.
under federal transportation.
I never made the connection because there's
The
certain
DO,
airports. Yeah, there's certain airports you can't land at if your gross weight is over 100,000 pounds as an aircraft.
right? Yeah, because the
So
runway won't
yeah,
hold it.
yep, yep. And so
And
there's a lot of aircraft that are specifically built. They're like their gross weight is like 98,000 pounds
right,
because they know that their customers, and these are usually private aircraft, but sometimes these are small commercial jets. Um, the OEMs know the regulatory environment. I'm sure that the trucking industry, the folks that make the semi trailers and the manufacturers of the actual tractor trailers, they probably understand these regulations in depth. They could probably benefit from your expertise too. But I didn't know that there was an 80,000 pound limit. I was actually going to ask you that question. Um, why is the weight limit there? Is it more for safety or wear and tear on the roads? I guess what's the reasoning behind, from your perspective?
it kind of all in one. Safety reasons, braking distance, stopping distance. But then yeah, wear and tear on the roads, bridges are a big factor. Um, so yeah, they kind of just jumble everything all together and say, okay, this is kind of the industry standard. Certain states say you can go over, like the state of Kansas, you're allowed to run 85,500 pounds.
Cool.
Um, Now you still have to be within certain tolerances on your groups of axles. You can't be super heavy on your axles on your truck and then not have much on your trailer. It's got to be spread out evenly.
Okay. What would you say is like the optimum weight balance for safety? If you could load your own truck and distribute the weight, I know it's not always feasible because some of the cargo has to be unloaded before others. But what's the optimum weight distribution for that type of application? I'm curious about that.
Their legal weights are set. Um, you want more of your weight on the trailer if you could get it.
Okay.
You want
Yeah,
to.
that makes a lot of sense.
There's demonstration videos on it that kind of explain it better, but it shows if we load up here where more of the weight's on the vehicle, and this is for smaller stuff like a pickup pulling a little bumper pull trailer,
Okay.
tractor trailer. Um, it's all got to go on there, so it's there's certain loads that ride good and there's certain loads that don't. When I was driving over the road, I drove a flatbed, and one of my favorite things to haul was flat steel because it was easy to secure, it was easy to tarp, and it rode good.
Yep.
Because of the it was a heavy load, but it was spread out over most of the deck of the trailer. As opposed to you pick up a coil and it's just as heavy of a load, but it's the size of I don't know your refrigerator, and it weighs 45,000 pounds, and it's sitting right in the
Oh,
middle of your trailer.
seriously?
Yeah,
What? Yeah, I guess when you see like these oversized loads, either carrying, wind turbine blades or, you know, uh, or houses, what's the most difficult thing to transport? From your perspective, I don't really know about this. I mean, what's the most difficult thing from a regulatory or safety perspective to transport over the road as far as cargo goes?
Probably probably some of the things that I saw were the most difficult for the transporters were like parts for a power plant or a hydroelectric
Okay.
dam. Those turbines in a hydroelectric dam and all the generator and everything that goes with it has to be assembled at a plant. Well, then it's got to be moved in all in one piece, um, and that's when you start seeing the companies that are known worldwide for coming in and moving things like that.
Okay.
They've
So
got
those are specialized companies.
specialized. These guys they only do things like there's documentaries on all sorts of those kinds of mega move things. Well, that's all these guys do is move things that aren't supposed to be moved.
Is there specialized motors that are in these trucks to be able to have enough horsepower and torque to pull these huge?
They'll have trucks with big motors, and they'll have trucks daisy chained together in front of and behind the load, pushing and pulling on it at the same time.
That's a real thing.
Yeah, it's a very real thing.
Oh wow. Okay, I'd love to see that. I'm gonna ask you about
Yeah,
that
it's
documentary later.
it's kind of and you'll see it where they come through a town. They'll take power lines down to where a load can come through a town.
Oh, okay.
And
I
you
didn't
got
realize that.
and you don't have just guys in trucks. There's guys in pickups, and yeah, they're out there working with the power company. There's guys on four wheelers going up and down the line, making sure that every power line that needed to get moved got moved, or if they had to take out stoplights, making sure all that stuff's clear before they get there. To where okay, we've got some room here, we can stop to where people can get around us while they get whatever this problem is fixed. Instead of getting
Yeah.
to it, and now we're somewhere to where people can't get around us. It's a whole it's an orchestra really, the way that they put
No, that's a
everything
lot of
together and make it
planning.
happen.
That's a lot of planning involved. Yeah. That's you've got my brain turning now. I didn't even realize that that was a thing. I mean, I've seen large cargo loads being transported over the road, but nothing of the kind of the scale that you're talking about. I think that's fascinating. But I got to ask you. I mean, I meant to ask you this earlier in the interview, but what's your favorite machine?
My absolute favorite machine is probably the Case IH Steiger 620 horse tractor.
Okay.
Um, I've gotten to run them a couple of small occasions, and they're just to me they're kind of a personification of power. You see one sitting there, and it's big and red and it's shiny and it's kind of got a graceful look to it. Then you get in it and start working it, and it's got plenty of power to work and just hook onto about anything and drag it around.
That's
Uh,
amazing. What does it feel like to operate one of those? I would love to operate machinery like that. I've always been fascinated by heavy equipment. I love driving anything with a diesel motor, but uh, what does it feel like to be like in a behemoth like that? How does it make you feel?
you remember you remember what it was like when you were a little kid playing in the sandbox with your Tonka trucks?
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah.
It's that times a million. We
I
we
want to. I
never
want to. Yeah.
we never really grow up. Our sandbox and our toys just gets bigger.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I've always had an affinity for anything motor powered. I mean, everything since I was a kid. I mean, I hadn't told anyone that story about riding on my uncle's scooter, but anything that I could get on and interact with. And that's why I wanted to do this whole series. I mean, I was like, man, what do I like to do? I have a kind of a wide variety of interests, but they all have a common theme. They all kind of involve the human machine interface. So I love interacting with machines, especially powerful machines. Like the first time I ever flew a turbine powered aircraft was just that's what it felt like to me. It felt like you were in a behemoth. And I mean, these things have, some of these turboprops have, I think over 1,000 brake horsepower to the shaft. And so these things are powerful and they have unlimited energy. They just burn the heck out of Jet A. They're not fuel efficient by any means, but they require so much power to stay at altitude, um, and really defy gravity. I guess you're kind of defying the laws of physics.
Yeah, an
But
airplane
my
kind of just
dream,
beats gravity into submission.
yeah, exactly. And I've always wanted to fly a helicopter. I've had a couple opportunities, but we had crappy weather and it didn't work out. I think my dream would be to fly like some sort of turbofan powered aircraft. But I'd settle for another turboprop because that was an amazing experience. I'd just gotten my pilot's license, and so I was legally qualified to fly it. I was with a very experienced pilot on the right seat. There's no way I could fly it by myself. But when you hear that turbine motor spool up, so it initially uses an electric motor to spin the turbine and get enough airflow in there. You don't want to add the fuel too early. If you add the fuel too early, you can over temp the engine and do a hot start, is what they call it in aviation. It's really, really bad for the engine, depending on how high the temps get. You actually have to overhaul the whole engine and inspect every critical piece of the engine, which is $500,000 to do that on an engine like that. Just the inspection. That's not even replacement parts. So like, but I love, so you hear that motor spinning and you hear the airflow around the turbine engine, and then you add the fuel. You hear that fuel pump activate when you hit the fuel button, and then it just exponentially starts spinning faster and faster and faster until until the propeller is just like moving so fast that you can't even see it with the naked eye. And man, I'm getting off on a tangent like that, but yeah, I love machines. So I think you and I could do a whole series on agriculture too. I mean, we only kind of scratched the surface on, kind of your experience with agricultural equipment, but I think a lot of people don't realize that, 1/3 of people in the US used to be farmers. And with the advent of, I'm glad you're one of them, still, but with the advent of technology, one person like yourself can farm, quite a bit of acreage by themselves with the technology that's out there. You don't need, it's not as labor intensive as it was 100 years ago.
Yeah. There's less farmers than there's ever been, and they're feeding more people than they've ever fed. So yeah, the technology has just allowed these guys to do more with less, and it's become more comfortable on them when they're not as fatigued. They can spend more hours in the field. Um, they're physically, mentally, all just it's the advancements really come in for them. The equipment I use is older stuff, and 4 or 5 hours, and that's a long day out there.
Yep.
With modern equipment, there's guys that spend 18, 20 hours in the field, weather permitting.
18 to 20 hours
Oh yeah,
during harvest time or during a specific time of
harvest and
year.
planning and harvest seasons. You really start seeing guys going hard. As long as the weather's good, they're pretty well going to run.
I have so much
They'll shut
respect for you.
down, do their little maintenance period, and then get a nap, and then be right back at it. As soon as they can.
I have so much respect for you and the fact that you work a full-time job, you're raising a young family, and you're farming on the side. Not really on the side. I mean, it's part of your life. I don't want to get too personal on this podcast, but I think you're just like setting an incredible example for your kids. I think having a father figure in the house like you, and also a fellow veteran, which is, I really value that. I was honored to be able to serve with you in Afghanistan and at Fort Bliss, Texas. I can't tell you how much our friendship means to me. Um, I think having a father figure like you in the house is critical for young women and young men alike, especially young men though. So to see their dad get up at the crack of dawn, I know because I'm up too. I'm texting you at 4 a.m. I think it sets a good baseline for what is acceptable behavior as a man, and you're just a pillar of your family. I think people like you are just such the critical bedrock to our civilization here in the United States, and the fact that you signed the dotted line and raised your right hand and wore that U.S. flag on your right shoulder means even more. But I want to be respectful of your time. I could talk to you for probably another 3 hours, to be honest.
Oh yeah,
But I
we could do
want
this
to
all
leave.
night.
I know. Honestly, we could. And I'd love to talk to you again, but I wanted to reserve the last bit of time to see if there's any questions you had for me. People are not going to be familiar with this podcast because it's brand new. So, and I think you were, curious about it as well. But is there anything you want to ask me about my life, the podcast, what I'm trying to, anything? It's kind of open door for you. So
The one question I really thought of was what inspired you to want to do this, and you kind of already answered that for me. You're just fascinated by how man and machine fits together, and the advancements of it, how it's made things easier on us, but we're also leaning on it pretty heavy too.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think so. There's two facets to that. I think people like you, who already have like an incredible work ethic and know how to utilize technology to their advantage, are going to have a massive advantage in the next 20 years. You're going to be quick to adopt new technologies. You already have kind of a mechanical mind. I've seen this firsthand. I'm not just making this up. I've seen you interact with a striker, not only the motor but every system in that vehicle, and I've seen how kind of your attention to detail and just like you're naturally good with electromechanical parts in general. So people like you will benefit from technology. It'll just leverage your abilities and really leverage your ability to make more money and be more successful. I'm sure you already have a breadth of job opportunities in front of you. Um, but I think what my goal is to kind of show people, and talking to experts in the field like you and how you use technology in your daily life and how you use technology in the Army. Those are kind of the two of the themes I'm focused on. I want to show people that technology is already a part of our lives. This is already happening, and the people that can harness it to their advantage. Um, I think the opportunities are endless. And yes, technology is going to disrupt a lot of career fields. It's going to maybe leave some people feeling confused or left behind. But I think the people that adopt it to their advantage are going to use it to leverage their own human abilities and their God given gifts.
Oh,
I don't know.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and thank you for those very kind and undeserving words. I just, I, I was raised by a pretty similar man. Yeah, just got up and went every day because that's what you do. It's
Yeah.
got to get done. It's not going to do itself.
It's not going to do itself. Man, there's so many quotes I want to take from this podcast that you've said. You have so many awesome quotes that I want to leave people with, and I hope some of our friends, watch this and gain some knowledge from your experience, because I think your Army experience and then your experience in the commercial trucking industry and well, in several different industries within the commercial trucking, um, is pretty incredible. So I want people to know that there's opportunities out there, but you just have to show up and work hard to get them. So like you have,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, I miss you, brother. I love you, brother, and I hope we get to talk
Miss you too,
again
man. Love you.
soon. All
Yeah.
right, see
Anytime,
you.
man. Thank.
I enjoyed this a lot.
Me too, man. Yeah, we need to find some more things we need to talk about on here.
I'm down. See ya.